Systematic strategies. That's what I'm trying to describe. Not just the armor. You hear that so typically online that the narcissist puts up armor, but the part that I'm encouraging you to consider are there are also these unyielding defenses that function to help you avoid anxiety by keeping you from truly engaging with others and with reality. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In today's episode, we're going to return to our, and I quote, consolidation series, where we slow things down and think more carefully about your questions. Your questions are important, and they become a way for us to revisit and clarify the material we've been working through in prior episodes. This is also an opportunity to take these ideas, like psychic retreats, and connect them more directly to your everyday experience, looking at how these dynamics actually show up in you and in your relationships. With that in mind, let's move directly into the complexity and begin thinking psychodynamically about your questions and comments. Recently, I received a question from a listener, and I quote, it's about psychic retreats. This listener wrote, "Psychic retreat is an interesting concept for me. It begs the question, where does coping mechanism end and dependency on the psychic retreat start? I'm fascinated to know how one steps away and breaks the dependency on a psychic retreat. Obviously, treatment is the key, but where does one start?" Before we dive into answering it, it's worth taking a step back for a quick review of what John Steiner meant by this concept, because understanding it fully helps us see where coping ends and dependency begins. I have to say, I'm really excited about this question because when we think about narcissism, understanding psychic retreats is absolutely central. This concept is intimately connected to how narcissistic personalities protect themselves from shame, dependency, anxiety, depressive affect, or emotional overwhelm, and it shows up in so many of the patterns that you experience. Before we dig into answering it, let's take a step back for a quick review of what Steiner meant by this concept, because understanding it more fully helps us see where coping ends and dependency begins. At the most basic level, a psychic retreat is a type of withdrawal, a way of closing off, of failing to allow genuine contact with another person. It can take many forms, and keeping in mind the relational dynamics we often see, we can say that it shows up as aloofness, a sense of superiority, or a kind of cold condensation, a way of distancing yourself from others while keeping them at bay. It can also appear as dismissiveness, sarcasm, or subtle mocking of someone else's perspective or work. Sometimes even the work of someone that you care about or that you're in a relationship with. And the work can be anything from working on a relationship to working around the house, for instance. The retreat is, at its core, a way of protecting yourself. Perhaps the most difficult type of retreat is one in which a false type of contact is offered. You're invited to engage, but you can only do so in ways that feel superficial or inauthentic. The person, whether it's you, someone else, or both of you in this interpersonal dynamic, retreats behind, and I quote, a powerful system of defenses, serving as a protective armor or a hiding place. So let me emphasize, it's a family of unyielding defenses. That's critical. Systematic strategies, that's what I'm trying to describe. Not just the armor. You hear that so typically online, right? That the narcissist puts up armor, but the part that I'm encouraging you to consider are there are also these unyielding defenses that function to help you avoid anxiety by keeping you from truly engaging with others and with reality. And I'm going to return to this in a moment or two. Here's a simple example. You might withdraw from a difficult discussion, respond passively when asked for input, or put off making a decision. All ways that your mind keeps you safe from anxiety or any kind of emotional exposure. Most often, the retreat is experienced as idealized, represented as a pleasant, even perfect haven. So, yes, it can feel like a blissful state in a narcissistic relationship. There's the parallel. But whether it appears idealized or persecutory, think of how a narcissistic relationship oscillates between idealization and devaluation. One minute there's this blissful union, and the next minute somebody's feeling quite persecuted. But the point is, it's clung to. It's clung to because it feels preferable to what you imagine as even worse states of mind. In other words, this state is better than what you imagine would happen if you're outside the psychic retreat. So you convince yourself that these extremes are the only alternatives. So the whole relationship, that's what I'm saying, and I think you're hearing it correctly if you're wondering, the whole relationship can become a form of psychic retreat. This part is critical. The range of the retreat can vary. Some people are able to maintain adequate relationships in certain areas of life while remaining stuck in other areas of life. Other people may almost completely disappear into the retreat, neglecting work, daily responsibilities, or relationships with loved ones. This brings us closer to the listener question. So yes, I still have that in mind. I was just laying down some foundation by doing a little bit of review. But I think now we're getting back to the listener question. It's closer because, remember the question was, where does a coping mechanism end and a dependency on the retreat begin? Dependency may begin when the retreat becomes a place where you remain stuck. In these cases, the retreat continues even when it causes suffering that may be chronic and sustained, or even masochistic and addictive. Being stuck in the retreat means there's very little to no flexibility. In other words, there's no fluidity. Dependency develops because the retreat is relied upon to protect you from very primitive states of fears, I should say, of fragmentation and persecution. There is fear that extreme anxiety or extreme depressive states would overwhelm you if you were to emerge from it. In some cases, adherence to the retreat forms an addiction and brings considerable suffering. Despite the evidence of the suffering it may cause, such as times of what? Loneliness, obsessional thinking, ruminating. It may be chronic, sustained, and I mentioned a moment ago, even masochistic and addictive. But despite this suffering, the retreat often remains the preferred mode of functioning. See, what I'm emphasizing again is what a grip it has on you, and also what a way of life this becomes. Can you see how, I hope, how this begins to answer the listener's question and about where coping ends and dependency begins? Are you beginning to see that? What we're seeing here is no longer coping in the usual sense. Coping would require or look like one would have more flexibility, allowing you to manage anxiety or distress while still engaging with reality and maintaining connection with others. Dependency on the retreat, by contrast, is rigid and persistent. It keeps you stuck, avoiding anxiety at the cost of real engagement, intimacy, or responsibility in life. In other words, the retreat becomes the default mode of functioning, and I quote that, the default mode, not a temporary strategy. So it prevents contact with reality and ensures that growth and development are consistently interfered with. That's the stuckness that I mentioned. Not as if, but life is not moving forward. Again, when the psychic retreat functions as a coping mechanism, it is brought into play only when anxiety exceeds tolerable limits, but then is relinquished once the crisis passes. So I hope that gets at the heart of the question. That's the big difference. This is when it's a coping mechanism. See, there's fluidity there, which is lacking, when you're entrenched in the psychic retreat. Let me give an example of it used as a coping mechanism. She comes out of her, and I quote, she shed, or he emerges to make contact once he leaves his, and I quote, man cave. But for the more narcissistically organized individual, the psychic retreat comes to dominate the personality, and you become caught in its grip. The listener also asked a crucial question. How does someone step away from that retreat? Remember, that was part of her question. The first step in stepping away from the retreat is to recognize that the stepping away will not feel like relief. It will often feel like increased anxiety, exposure, or even fragmentation, a fear that you're falling apart, that you can't live without it. That discomfort is not a sign that something is going wrong, but an indication that the retreat is no longer doing its protective work in the same way. In terms of stepping away from the retreat, escaping the retreat, this is not a single act, but a gradual process of re-engagement with reality, with others, and with your own emotional experiences. But before this is even possible, stepping away from the retreat begins with a growing awareness of the retreat. You see what I mean? In other words, you can't step away from something if you don't know what it is, or that you're even in it, or that you go to it. Perhaps, or I can say maybe because you're listening to this podcast, you start to notice patterns, emotional detachment, avoidance of intimacy, or a tendency to live more in fantasy than in actual experience. So maybe we can say that is the first step. Okay, so back to the listener question, how does one step away? This is the first step, is you have to be able to know and label, understand what a retreat looks like. From there, the question actually deepens. What is the retreat protecting you from? Often, beneath it are experiences of early relational disappointment, humiliation, shame. I mentioned this earlier, I'm just reviewing. Overwhelming anxiety and depression, unmet dependency needs, or a fear of being emotionally exposed, to name just a few. Because the real answer to that question, in terms of what is it protecting you from, is unknown. It's subjective. It's idiosyncratic. And that's where the therapy comes in terms of discovering that, or your own reflective process in terms of discovering that. So that's where the more difficult part is, by the way. And that's what comes next, if I was putting these in order. Risking emotional contact again. That's part of the way you'll recognize or you'll identify what it's protecting you from once you risk emotional contact. This doesn't happen all at once. It happens in small, incremental moments. And again, for those of you following along on the podcast, you frequently hear me mention these little moments, micro moments. In a moment, you may be better able sometimes to tolerate disagreement without withdrawing, staying present in a difficult conversation, or allowing yourself to need someone, or simply to engage someone, to ask for something, rather than pulling away and saying, I could do this on my own. It may even be something as simple as noticing the impulse to retreat, reaching for your phone, for example, shutting down, pulling back, and asking yourself in those moments, what do I imagine would happen if I didn't? And by the way, the listener asked, in treatment, what happens in treatment? But this is what I do. Actually, this is something that I help patients reflect on. What if you wait just another moment before you grab your phone? Or what feeling is trying to emerge here? That's another question you can ask yourself. What feeling is trying to emerge that I'm evading by turning to my phone? Over time, these small risks, such as, again, when you have the urge to leave, walk away, or in my example, a patient who wants to end the session 5 minutes early, and I encourage them to stick with it, and they do that, or you don't walk away. These moments begin to show that emotional experience, however uncomfortable, is something that you can survive, rather than something that must be avoided. So, in therapy, when there are moments of contact, this is something I would note and pulled to the fore so it can be acknowledged and discussed. If this contact is registered, the patient sometimes gains an insight into their dread of contact with themselves or with me, by the way. Or they may feel supported by me. In other words, they stay the extra or the last 5 minutes of the session and recognize, hey, that wasn't so bad. I got through it and I wasn't judged, or whatever they feared. And as a result, and this part is critical, as a result of this, they may gradually extend the ability to tolerate reality and contact, extend it for longer moments of time. So back to your cell phone, just as a simple example, that you don't grab it, but you wait a couple minutes before retreating to the phone. If the patient feels that I understand the nature of the anxiety, if I understand them, and I can understand what's confronting them, then they begin to emerge from the retreat, and they're more likely to feel supported, and thus take further steps away from the dependence on the psychic retreat. Taken together, what allows someone to step away is not force, but the experience of being understood, where they can slowly re-enter emotional life and begin to recognize that the retreat, while once protective, now interferes with the very connections they seek. As we begin to wrap this up, I want to emphasize that I don't mean to suggest this process is simple. Remember, earlier I mentioned that the psychic retreat can function as a highly structured system. It's a family of defenses that become quite rigid, even ossified over time. And of course, part of the personality, because we are talking about a personality disorder. At times, the retreat can take on a more complex. So yes, it does get more complicated than what we're covering here. It could take on a more complex, even a perverse quality, something we often see in sadomasochistic relational dynamics. Some people call this trauma bonding, where suffering and protection become intertwined. In this sense, the retreat is not only avoiding reality, but can also reshape one's relationship to reality and to others in ways that are difficult to reorganize. Look, there's still so much more to say about that. And if it's something you're interested in, I can explore it further in a future episode. Just let me know. What I'm talking about is a perverse quality. And that just means, I'm using the word perverse here as sort of the gray area of relating, the gray area between the suffering and the connecting. But for now, if we can begin to understand the retreat in this way, we're in a better position, whether this is something you recognize in yourself or in someone close to you, to notice those moments when contact becomes possible and to be more available for when it does. I hope this has made the idea of psychic retreats embedded within a narcissistic organization a little bit more understandable, and that it begins to answer both parts of the question, where coping ends and dependency begins, and how someone can begin to step away from the retreat. If not, of course, send me an email, let me know what I confused today, and I'll be glad to continue this discussion. And overall, please keep these wonderful and important questions coming. Okay, until next time, bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.